As 1943 came to an end, Admiral Chester Nimitz' Central Pacific offensive was gathering strength. After capturing the Gilbert Islands in November, his forces now set their sights on the Marshall Islands as the next objective in the lengthy campaign toward Tokyo. Designated Operation Flintlock, the strategy involved Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's V amphibious force bypassing the Marshall's stronger outer defenses to directly attack Kwajalein Atoll in the archipelago's center. MAJ, General Holland M. Howland Mad Smith, USMC, leading V amphibious corps, chose the Army's experienced 7th Infantry Division to secure naval facilities at Kwajalein Island in the atoll's southern group, while MAJ. General Harry Schmidt's untested 4th Marine Division, arriving directly from San Diego, would capture Roi-Namur and its valuable airfield, situated 44 miles to the north. Flat and desolate Roi spanned 1,200 by 1,250 yards, offering just enough space for the airfield. Connected to Roi by a 400-yard causeway and a narrow sand spit along the lagoon lay Namur, covering 800 by 900 yards of densely forested terrain that sheltered the garrison's barracks and other installations. The islands hosted 35 aircraft and approximately 2,000 personnel from Japanese Vice Admiral Michiyuki Yamada's 24th Air Flotilla, alongside a 345-strong contingent from the 61st Guard Force and roughly 1,200 service troops. For protection, Roi-Namur featured 2 batteries of twin-mounted 127mm guns, 4 37mm cannons, 1913, 2mm heavy machine guns, and 10 20mm anti-aircraft guns, with nearly all positioned northward in expectation of an ocean landing. 8 blockhouses and 52 pillboxes dotted the landscape, supplemented by general-purpose machine guns throughout. Anti-tank ditches and fighting trenches encircled the beaches. After a 2-month aerial campaign, Rear Admiral Richard Connolly's Task Force 53 approached on January 29, 1944, initiating a massive 3-day bombardment that pummeled defenders with over 2,655 tons of explosives. The Navy's 2.5-hour preparatory barrage at Tarawa in November 1943 had proven disastrously insufficient, resulting in 3,178 Marine casualties. Consequently, Admiral Connolly was determined to eliminate every person, tree, and structure on Roi-Namur. The initial objectives were 5 outlying islands, secured by the 25th Marines on D-Day, January 31st, with minimal difficulty. With these positions established, the howitzers of the 14th Marines were positioned to support the main invasion scheduled for the following morning. Throughout the night, U.S. Navy gunners relentlessly shelled the unfortunate islands. Just before dawn on February 1st, the bombardment temporarily halted to allow the cumbersome Marine carrying LST's landing ships tanked to break from the fleet and enter the lagoon. Once positioned, the shelling resumed with renewed intensity. In the lagoon, Marines prepared for action. Colonel Louis Jones' 23rd Marines were assigned to capture Roi with LT. Call Hewan Hammond's 1st Battalion landing on Red Beach 2 Walty. Call Edward Dillon's 2nd Battalion assaulted Red Beach 3 to Hammond's right. Colonel Franklin Hart's 24th Marines would simultaneously attack Namur. Hart selected LT. Call Austin Brunelli's 3rd Battalion to storm Green Beach 1 while LT. Call Francis Brink's 2nd Battalion hit Green 2 to the right of the L-shaped Yokohama Pier, which served as the battalion boundary. W-hour. The assault time was set for 10 a.m. The infantry was organized into boat and assault teams, with the former consisting of riflemen and the latter comprising demolition specialists, bazooka operators, and machine gunners, all transported in LVT-2's landing vehicle, tracked. These amphibious tractors, or Amtraks, featured cleated treads designed to traverse barrier reefs. Each carried 18 to 24 men. 4 companies of armored LVTAS AMTanks, equipped with turreted 37mm cannons and machine guns, would precede the infantry. Follow-up units would arrive in flat-bottomed LCVP's landing craft vehicle personnel. The assault waves of the 23rd Marines would be transported by the 4th Amphibian Tractor Battalion, while those of the 24th would ride the Amtraks of the 10th Battalion. However, the 10th was in disarray after continuous service the previous day ferrying elements of the 25th Marines to the outlying islands. The crews had endured a long, grueling ordeal, expending most of their fuel and virtually all their energy while transporting personnel and supplies to and from various islets. As darkness fell, many couldn't locate their motherships. Consequently, some LVTs ran out of fuel, causing bilge pumps to stop working. Several sank in the choppy seas, while others sought refuge on nearby beaches. By morning, only 62 of the 110 LVTs allocated for the Namur landings were operational. As late as 6:30 a.m., Captain Charles Berkeley, Jr., S Company G, one of the scheduled assault companies for Brink's Landing Team 2, couldn't secure enough LVTs for the landing, necessitating a last-minute change where Captain John Ross, Jr., S Company E, initially the battalion reserve, switched roles with G Company. Berkeley's men would have to wait until sufficient vessels could be gathered to transport them. Similar shortages affected Landing Team 3, but LT. Col Brunelli simply combined all available Amtraks until both assault companies had adequate transportation, while his reserve element, Company L, remained aboard its LST with no means to embark. Disorder replaced organization as the makeshift assault waves struggled to reach the line of departure. As a result, W hour was postponed until 11 a.m. Meanwhile, the Navy maintained its schedule. At 6:50 a.m., Rear Admiral Howard Kingman's Fire Support Unit 1 moved within 3,000 yards of Namur's ocean beaches to begin the final bombardment, while Rear Admiral Lawrence Dubos's Fire Support Team 2 targeted Roi with salvos. At first light, the howitzers of the 14th Marines joined in from neighboring islets. By then, the entire Japanese air fleet had been destroyed, along with the communications and command structure, including Admiral Yamada and his staff, all of whom perished in the rubble. While this unfolded, naval control officers responsible for coordinating the waves of the 24th Marines grew increasingly concerned as unscheduled units appeared while designated teams were nowhere in sight. 15 more minutes passed with little improvement. There were fears that unnecessary fuel consumption would endanger the LVTs circling impatiently in the lagoon. Furthermore, the initial landing teams still lacked proper reserves. Fortunately, the floating reserve, LT, Col Aquila Dias's 1st Battalion, was already embarked in LCVPs 3,000 yards behind the line of departure. Colonel Hart ordered companies A and B to fill the gap. But no sooner had these units arrived at the departure line than remnants of Company G appeared, loaded in a mix of LVTs and LCVPs, determined to reclaim their role as Landing Team 2's reserve. Wave officers were at their wits' end as Company A yielded its position. Just then, the red signal flag dropped from the control ship, launched the invasion. It was 11:12 a.m. The landing craft of the 23rd Marines sped toward their designated beaches. Caught unprepared, the coxswains transporting the disorganized 24th Marines accelerated their engines and set course for hostile shores, 4,000 yards away. LCIG gunboats landing craft. Infantry led the procession, followed by the armored LVTAS of the first wave with the assault infantry close behind. 1,000 yards from shore, the gunboats turned broadside and unleashed rockets and rapid-firing 40mm guns while the assault waves continued toward their destinations. On signal, the Navy's bombardment shifted to the interior as dive bombers began their final runs. At Roi, the 30 LVTAS assigned to the 23rd Marines charged forward aggressively, cutting through the thick battle haze with streams of tracers as they waddled ashore. They had barely landed when a formidable anti-tank ditch appeared just 60 feet from the surf. Unable to proceed inland, the armored tractors lurched to a halt while maintaining a steady fire from their machine guns and turreted cannons. It was 11:33 a.m. Within 20 minutes, the LVTs carrying the 23rd Marines clattered ashore. In the right sector, the Marines of Companies E and F from LT. Col Dillon's 2nd Battalion hit Red Beach 3 and scrambled up a slight rise, then dropped to peer apprehensively into a wall of smoke and dust. Although plenty of gunfire flashed overhead, very little seemed incoming. Naval artillery had destroyed virtually every beachside pillbox, leaving Japanese defenses in ruins. Dillon's men crossed the ditch, shooting the few disoriented defenders they encountered, then moved rapidly inland. By then, the M4 Sherman medium tanks of Company C, 4th Tank Battalion, had landed, followed by several light tanks from Company A. After crossing a collapsed section of the anti-tank ditch, these quickly joined the assault. Within 20 minutes of landing, the Marines had reached the 01 phase line along the lower arm of the airfield, about 200 yards inland. Company G landed shortly after and began clearing out any bypassed enemies. On the far left, LT, Col Hammond's 1st Battalion landed on Red Beach 5 minutes behind Dillon's men, also facing minimal opposition. Captain James Scales' company A turned left to assault a pair of large pillboxes reportedly occupying Wendy Point, 300 yards away. These Marines found only smoldering, rubble-filled craters where the fortifications supposedly stood, silent testimony to the Navy's devastating firepower. Wendy Point, expected to be a tough fight, proved easily taken. Having secured their first objective without resistance, Scales' men dashed up the western shore to claim their sector of the 01 line. En route, a burst of gunfire erupted from a large blockhouse designated Buster 400 yards up the coast, but this too was quickly silenced after Marines crept close enough to bombard its entrance with grenades. While Scales' men secured Wendy Point, Captain William Weinstein's Company B advanced effortlessly inland to join Dillon's men along the crater-pitted runway, where resistance proved minimal at best. Live Japanese soldiers were scarce. At times, Bangalore torpedoes or satchel charges were needed to eliminate a few persistent riflemen who sniped from nearby trenches and debris-covered culverts, but by 1 p.m. all elements were online and eager to proceed. By then, Colonel Jones had landed and established his regimental command post near the beach. Elated by the ease of the operation, he radioed General Schmidt aboard the amphibious support ship USS Appalachian. "This is a pip," he declared, adding a few minutes later, "Give us the word and we'll take the rest of the island." General Schmidt advised Jones to remain calm and prepare for the second phase of the attack. Captain Robert Neiman, commander of Company C, 4th Tank Battalion, had no intention of waiting. His M4 medium tanks sat idle and exposed on the flat, open terrain, presenting tempting targets for the numerous anti-tank guns reported to infest the area. Preferring action over inaction, Neiman ordered his command to advance. The tanks moved forward, blasting every suspicious structure with their 75mm guns, while bow gunners cut down individual Japanese soldiers who scurried like frightened rabbits before the massive treads. Seeing the tanks lumbering across the plain, the Marines of Company A moved out to provide protection while a platoon of AM tanks advanced along the western coast in support. By 1:30 p.m., several M4s were engaging enemy machine gunners defending the northeastern runway terminus called Nat Circle, while 6 others patrolled the northern airstrip. Victory seemed imminent. However, General Schmidt was displeased with this unauthorized action and ordered Jones to recall his Wildcats lest they fall victim to the preliminary bombardment scheduled for the final push. It took nearly an hour before the unauthorized units were reined in and order restored at the 01 line. Phase 2 was to launch at 3:15 p.m., with each assault battalion advancing straight up its respective half of the island. At 3:10 p.m., the cruiser Santa Fe began pounding 5-inch shells into troublesome Nat Circle. 20 minutes later, the 2nd Battalion attacked, supported by a 75mm half-track firing from mid-island. Although 20mm fire sputtered from Nat Circle, resistance was sporadic at best, with Marines discovering many more dead than living Japanese. Within 7 minutes, Captain John Padley's Company F was clearing skeletal hangars along the northern runway, while Captain Neiman's tanks re-engaged the enemy defending Nat Circle. Captain Carl Grussendorf's Company E kept pace on Padley's left. While advancing, 4 of Grussendorf's Marines tumbled into a shell hole, believing enemy soldiers occupied a nearby trench. Unwilling to take unnecessary chances, PFC Richard Anderson had just pulled the pin of a grenade when it slipped from his grasp and rolled to the bottom of their crater. Realizing his mistake, Anderson threw himself on the bomb to save his comrades. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Initially, Hammond's 1st Battalion remained stationary to provide supporting fire for Dillon's men and didn't join the advance until 4 p.m. Led by a platoon of light tanks, Captain Fred Eberhardt's Fresh Company C raced up the western seashore, followed by three 75mm half-track guns. Mutilated Japanese corpses littered the landscape, remnants of the fierce naval bombardment. The little resistance encountered came in the form of isolated rifle and machine gun fire. In less than an hour, Eberhardt's men were clearing Norbert Circle on the island's northwestern corner. Now only Nat Circle remained. Although Captain Neiman's tanks had destroyed several enemy positions, one pillbox continued to spew machine gun fire in three directions. Colonel Dillon ordered his reserve, Captain Frank Snep's Company G, to eliminate it, while a half-track battered its steel door with 75mm rounds. A demolitions team moved in for the kill. When someone noticed a rupture in the roof, a Marine carrying a Bangalore torpedo climbed up and jammed it through the fissure, while comrades ignited shaped charges at the apertures. Before the dust settled, a half-dozen Marines dashed inside and found 3 machine guns and 3 dead gunners. They also noted that the fort's firing slits, like many of the island's defenses, face only north, east, and west, making their lagoon approach considerably easier. By 4:45 p.m., all major resistance on Roi had ceased. Although the usual mopping up operations had yet to be completed, Colonel Jones declared the island secure at 6:02 p.m. For the most part, the battle for Roi had indeed been a pip. Namur would prove to be a different story. 1,000 yards from Namur's beaches, the disorganized assault waves of the 24th Marines churned past the rocket-firing LCIGs as they sped toward war's seething cauldron. Nearly 36 cannon-equipped AMTanks from Companies B and D, 1st Armored Amphibian Battalion, led the way, ordered to push 100 yards inland upon landing. For unknown reasons, the entire wave stopped 50 yards short of the surf line, where the landing craft continued to bombard the unseen enemy. Minutes later, the infantry's Amtrak scurried past the hesitant LVTAS. Risking enemy fire, 2nd LT, John Chapin of Company K peered over the bow of his vehicle and searched for his assigned landing site on Green Beach 1. He saw nothing but churning smoke and dust. Uncertain, he turned to consult with his platoon sergeant, only to discover his right-hand man slumped over dead, his skull reduced to a bloody pulp. Shaken, Chapin refocused on the island before him. Several hundred yards to Chapin's right, the amphibious tractors of 2nd Battalion clambered over Green Beach 2 shortly before noon, while his own battalion struck Green 1 shortly after. All came ashore with machine guns blazing, intending to deposit their Marines 100 yards inland, but as on Roi, a deep anti-tank ditch forced them to an abrupt halt. Officers shouted, "Let's go!" and vaulted the gunwales. Covering fire intensified as heavily laden Marines plunged a full 7 feet to the beach below, and then scrambled forward a few yards to drop breathless before the obstructing ditch. On Green 1, intermittent machine gun fire scattered several boat teams as Captain Albert Arsenault Company I and Captain Doyle Stout's Company K disembarked. Lying in the sand, Chapin asked his platoon guide if he knew his men's location. No sooner had the sergeant begun pointing than his hand disintegrated in a spray of blood and bone. Wild-eyed, the sergeant gripped his splintered stump and began yelling, "Sailor! Sailor!" using the current term for corpsman, having been told that snipers understood the latter's meaning and would invariably target any medic who hurried to his aid. Having lost 2 key subordinates within minutes, young Chapin wondered if Namur was about to devolve into another Tarawa. On Green 2, elements of both assault companies also became entangled upon landing, but fortunately resistance in their sector was nearly non-existent. Occasionally, a Japanese soldier would spring from a trench, fire a round or two, then disappear. Marines answered with a barrage of grenades followed by a headlong charge that ended the gunman's life. Only on the far right was serious opposition encountered when erratic machine gun fire raked Company F from a pillbox positioned above Sally Point on the extreme southeastern promontory. But this, too, was soon subdued with the assistance of the heavy weapons of the 25th Marines firing from neighboring Enigaret Island. The boat and assault teams quickly cleared both beaches and pressed rapidly inland, only to encounter an unexpected obstacle. Roi had been flat and open to accommodate the airfield, but Namur was heavily forested. Now, thanks to the savage naval bombardment, heaps of palm fronds, splintered trunks, and other debris mingled with the undergrowth to conceal the island's buildings, bunkers, and pillboxes from view. As a result, the Marines advanced with measured caution. Sometimes a lone defender would stagger from concealment in a desperate bid to die for his emperor, accompanied by one or two others, but all fell in a hail of bullets. Elsewhere, defiant pillboxes required the skills of demolitions experts, while lesser positions were left for follow-up troops. Within 15 minutes, many teams had penetrated to a depth of 200 yards. At this point, the left flank of Brink's 2nd Battalion lost contact with Brunelli's 3rd. This troubling situation developed after elements of Company E landed directly behind Company AF on Green Beach 2. Upon entering the jumbled vegetation, both companies became tangled, with much of Company E somehow ending up on the battalion's right flank, a complete reversal of the order of advance. As a result, a substantial gap appeared on the battalion's boundary. Fortunately, about half of Captain Berkeley's Company G had made landfall by then and was immediately dispatched to fill the gap. However, these troops encountered increasingly stiff resistance from isolated enemy machine guns and riflemen and advanced no farther than 175 yards from the beach. Although they stumbled upon a lost team from Company E, the reserve was unable to establish contact with either assault battalion. Captain Berkeley's men weren't the only ones having a difficult time. In the 3rd Battalion sector, an assault team led by Chapin converged with that of Lieutenant John Power before a large, aggressively defended strongpoint constructed of sand-filled oil drums. Every attempt to bypass it was thwarted by scathing gunfire. Chapin and Power crouched behind a concrete wall 25 feet away to formulate a plan. Under heavy covering fire, Power led a pair of automatic riflemen to the rear entrance, while Chapin and another Marine armed with a Bangalore torpedo crept up to a narrow entrance near the front. Chapin tossed in a grenade, buying time for his companion to insert the torpedo. Both rolled away just as the entrance collapsed in an explosion of smoke and dust. Mission accomplished, they quickly joined Lieutenant Power, who had somehow acquired a shaped charge. This time Power led the assault, and the rear entrance vanished in a deafening roar as the bunker fell silent. About then, Chapin noticed blood oozing from Power's belly, but Power simply shrugged it off and rejoined his platoon. A short time later, Power faced another menacing pillbox. Intent on repeating his earlier feat, Power and a demolitions expert darted forward and placed their charge against its door, then winced as the blast ripped open a jagged hole. Pressing one hand against his bleeding stomach, Power inserted his carbine into the jagged opening and emptied its magazine. As he paused to reload, shots sounded from within. Power reeled as another bullet punched his gut while a third tore out his throat. Enraged, his Marines rushed forward and finished the job. Power was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Despite such desperate actions, enemy resistance remained scattered and uncoordinated. Captain Milton Coken's Company B hit Green Beach 1 at 12:45 p.m. and began mopping up operations. 3 light tanks of Company B, 4th Tank Battalion followed, only to become immobilized by soft sand and shell holes. Just as the crews dismounted to free their vehicles, nearly 36 Japanese swarmed from supposedly vacant pillboxes and charged the tankers, who cut them down with small arms, capturing 2 prisoners in the process at the cost of 1 Marine. Meanwhile, LT Col Brunelli's battalion advanced steadily up the western half of Namur, with one flank hugging the coast as his teams pushed toward the 01 phase line set at an east-west road codenamed Sycamore Boulevard, roughly 2/3 of the way inland. However, as with the rest of the island, this defining landmark was obscured by debris, making it difficult for on-site commanders to determine its location. To the east, the right flank of LT Col Brink's disorganized 2nd Battalion was harassed by intense machine gun fire coming from a sturdy blockhouse guarding Nut Lane near Nadine Point midway up the coast. Less than 200 yards to the left, other elements stopped short of Sycamore when another large bunker came into view. There was no indication that it was occupied, but it was feared that any attempt to bypass it would result in heavy flanking fire or counterattacks from any defenders who might be waiting inside. Realizing it would be foolhardy to ignore it, demolitions experts were summoned to employ their skills. An assault team, led by Lieutenant Saul Stein of Company F, approached from the left while Lieutenant Joseph E. Lopreet's group from Company E closed in from the right. Demolitions experts edged forward and placed a shaped charge against the bunker's wall, then quickly backed away. Upon detonation, 20 or more occupants bolted for the surrounding bush, no doubt convinced they had just survived a potentially fatal blast. Once the dust settled, it became obvious that the charge had worked. A cavernous hole gaped in the building side. The experts moved in again, this time with satchel charges that were flung into the gaping opening. What happened next was incomprehensible. Everything within sight vanished in one catastrophic explosion. Smoke and fire and chunks of concrete shot skyward as if launched by a volcanic eruption, drawing up a dark, gritty cloud that soared to a height of 1,000 feet or more. Those Marines not killed outright were rendered speechless, stunned by the sheer magnitude of the blast. Concussion waves knocked down men and trees and swept the lagoon with such force that incoming landing craft were stopped dead in the water. One Marine from Company F was blasted clear out to sea, where he was later rescued, miraculously intact, by the Navy. High overhead, an aerial observer reported, "The whole damned island has blown up." At the moment of detonation, every Marine's face on neighboring Roi snapped, eyes right, with parade ground precision. Many believed that the entirety of Namur had been destroyed, and every Marine there killed. Others thought that either the Navy had resumed its shelling or that a 500 or 1,000-pound bomb had been accidentally dropped. Later evidence proved that the bunker had been used as a munition storage facility, housing 100 or more torpedo warheads that were detonated by the demolition team's satchel charges. A heavy brown cloud billowed from the epicenter and seeped across Namur like something inherently evil. Suddenly, no one could see. Marines gagged and choked as acrid fumes filled their lungs. Fearing that the Japanese had launched a chemical attack, a few cried, "Gas! Gas!" as they frantically searched for protective masks discarded earlier as useless equipment. But the nightmare had only begun. Suddenly, massive chunks of reinforced concrete came screaming to Earth like killer asteroids, accompanied by smaller but no less deadly missiles of concrete, splintered tree trunks, and lumber, some of which splashed far out to sea. At least one Marine was crushed by the unholy avalanche, and others were injured. In addition, scores of the stored torpedo warheads tumbled from the darkness, some of which exploded upon impact. In rapid succession, 2 more shattering detonations rocked the front, possibly from other bunkers. For a time, chaos reigned. In all, 20 Marines were killed and some 100 wounded. The effect on Captain Garrison's Company F was devastating. 14 killed, including Lieutenant Stein, and 43 wounded. Lt. Col Brink was also injured but refused evacuation and quickly called up his recently landed reserve, Company A, to bolster his devastated command. While these morale-sapping events disrupted the regiment's momentum, they seemed to have encouraged the Japanese. Suddenly, the entire front came alive with the distinctive chatter of Nambu machine guns and the crack of Orisaka rifles. From that moment, the battle took a dramatic turn for the worse. What had once been a steady drive against fragmented and poorly organized defenders now disintegrated into an inch-by-inch progression as the scattered teams closed on the 01 line. By 2 p.m., most had reached Sycamore Boulevard, but every attempt to cross was checked by intense machine gun fire from 3 well-placed blockhouses fronting the 2nd Battalion sector. One at Nubbin Lane in the island center, another located at the end of Nut Lane, not far from Nadine Point on the east coast, and a third at a nearby intersection designated Road Junction 58. The tempo slowed and then ground to a halt. By that time, the regimental command post was ashore and fully operational. Realizing that the enemy had recovered from the stunning effects of the naval bombardment, Colonel Hart ordered a general halt to reorganize and reinforce his front with orders to resume offensive operations at 4:30 p.m. With the 2nd Battalion still reeling from the bunker catastrophe, Captain Irvin Schechter's Company A assumed operations on the far right flank, while Captain Horace Parks's freshly arrived Company C moved up to relieve the shaken Company E. At the same time, Captain Houston Stiff's Company L, which had finally found enough boats to make the landing, moved up to 3rd Battalion to relieve Company B from its mopping-up duties, enabling that unit to replace battle-weary Company K, which in turn was sent to Pauline Point, the finger-like sandbar jutting between Roi and Namur, to provide flanking fire for the upcoming attack alongside the regiment's heavier weapons. Now reorganized, the front ran from left to right as follows. Company I anchored the western shore abutting Company B near the junction of Sycamore Boulevard and Nasturtium Lane, while Company L hunkered as 3rd Battalion Reserve. In the center, half of 2nd Battalion's Company G carried the line eastward along Sycamore Boulevard with Companies FC and A extending the front toward Nadine Point. Remnants of Company E remained on line, having failed to learn of their relief. As the hour of attack drew nearer, several light tanks and LVTS rumbled up and began pumping 37mm shells into the 3 troublesome blockhouses that had plagued the infantry along Sycamore Boulevard. While those at Nubbin Lane and the road junction were neutralized, the guns proved too weak to penetrate the thick concrete of the Nut Lane bunker, which remained a thorn in the battalion side for the rest of the day. At precisely 4:30 p.m., Brunelli's 3rd Battalion launched its attack, but was stunned by the ferocity of the Japanese response. Pockets of resistance more than compensated for their lack of coordination with a tenacity born of desperation, pecking away with machine guns and sniper fire as Marines dashed forward amid bursting mortar shells. The dense terrain continued to conceal enemy strongpoints, and the advance on the left was justifiably slow. At one point, Corporal Alex Halachek's squad of Company B was pinned down by heavy machine gun fire. Halachek, already twice wounded, told his men to stay put while he scouted the gun's location. Now alone in enemy territory, he stormed the menacing weapon and killed its crew, enabling his squad to proceed. Halachek received the Navy Cross. On the right, the confusion of reorganization delayed the 2nd Battalion's attack for another hour. Supported by the light tanks of Company B, 4th Tank Battalion, the infantry crossed Sycamore Boulevard and entered a jungle crackling with small arms fire. Being forced to investigate every damaged building and pile of debris, the infantry soon lost contact with the tanks. The armor pressed on, covering one another with machine gun and canister fire as they navigated the jungle-like terrain. Within 20 minutes, it had reached Narcissus Street, 300 yards beyond the line of departure. Here, several tanks pivoted right and churned down the road as it cut southeast toward a junction with Sycamore Boulevard. After avoiding one obstacle, Captain James Denig's command tank became isolated from the others, so Denig stopped in a clearing to get his bearings. At that moment, 5 Japanese charged from the underbrush and swarmed his vehicle. One mounted the turret and dropped a grenade through a small signal port left open for ventilation, wounding the entire crew while setting the compartment on fire. Just then, PFC Howard Smith of Company A broke through the brush and sprayed the tank with his bar, killing 4 assailants while a buddy picked off the 5th. Climbing aboard the smoldering wreck, Smith pulled the mortally wounded Denig from the hatch, then returned to extract 2 others, but failed to rescue the driver who perished in the flames. Smith's actions earned him a Navy Cross. Meanwhile, Captain Garrison's decimated Company F finally broke through in the center and also reached Narcissus Lane, only 35 yards from the northern beach. Lacking proper support, Garrison was ordered back 100 yards where his men maintained a bulging salient. Things were perhaps even more desperate on the far right, where elements of Company A pushed up the eastern coast near Nadine Point. At the tip of the spear was an irascible, tobacco-chewing former Marine raider, Corporal Arthur Irvin, who charged far ahead of the lead scouts, flinging grenades and firing round after round at every Japanese soldier he saw. When the company encountered the formidable blockhouse at Nut Lane, it was Irvin who led the assault. First Lieutenant Roy Wood's platoon was close behind Irvin when heavy gunfire drove them to the ground. Dodging bullets, Lieutenant Phil Wood, no relation to Roy, and machine gunners George Smith and 18-year-old Steve Hopkins, son of presidential advisor Harry Hopkins, tumbled into a trench where they set up their Browning. Smith quickly went to work. adding to the chaos, while Wood summoned Hopkins to follow him farther down the trench. En route, they passed a Japanese corpse that suddenly sprang to life and pulled a grenade. Hopkins was startled, and his rifle was nearly touching the soldier's skull when he pulled his trigger. The Japanese soldier simply shook his head as if stunned. Shocked, Hopkins quickly emptied an entire clip into the superhuman. "Did you see, Mr. Wood?" Hopkins asked incredulously. "Did you see the grenade? Did you see what he was about to do?" Just then, Japanese mortar rounds began landing near the trench. Undaunted, the impetuous Irvin vaulted the parapet to conduct a one-man reconnaissance of the imposing Nut Lane blockhouse, killing 2 machine gunners as he did so while enemy bullets ripped the helmet from his head. Upon his return, Irvin gave his report. Lieutenant Phil Wood decided his platoon's 60mm mortars were the answer, but before the weapons could be deployed, bazooka rounds slammed into the bunker and Marines rushed forward. First to arrive were Irvin and Lieutenant Harry Reynolds, the company executive officer. Both hurled grenades through the embrasures until gunfire from a nearby dugout punctured Irvin's abdomen, evoking a stream of curses. Lieutenants Reynolds, Wood, and Wood grabbed a few men and rushed the offending position, bombarding it with grenades and rifle fire as Sergeant Frank Tucker and Corporal Franklin Robbins sprang up and charged. Tucker shot an enemy rifleman guarding the dugout's entrance, then both ducked inside and riddled the interior with bullets, killing every enemy soldier. Meanwhile, the Nut Lane bunker resumed firing. Hoping to outflank it, a dozen Marines crossed Sycamore Boulevard only to come under fire from a maze of entrenchments near the beach. Before others could join them, heavy machine gun fire swept the road, preventing further penetration. Led by Lieutenants Roy Wood and Reynolds, the isolated squad took matters into their own hands. Platoon Sergeant James Adams, a tag-along from battalion headquarters, charged the trench and gunned down a machine gun crew only to crumple dead in a hail of bullets. Close by, Corporal Robbins emptied several clips, single-handedly stopping an enemy counterattack before falling himself. Reynolds dropped several Japan Cecilgiers from behind a fallen log until a bullet slashed his leg. Down the line, Sergeant Tucker stood upright behind a shattered tree trunk and targeted dozens of enemy soldiers who scurried in the trenches a mere 15 yards away. Return fire ripped bark from Tucker's meager shelter. One round pierced his helmet and another drained his canteen, but Tucker kept firing. Noting Tucker's advantageous position, other Marines began tossing him grenades, which the sergeant hurled into the trench until all were exhausted. More bullets whacked Tucker's tree. Sensing disaster, the sergeant called for covering fire. PFCS. Lawrence Knight and Lester Kincaid hammered away with their bars. Just as Tucker scuttled away, a bullet splattered Knight's cheek. Angered, Knight resighted his weapon and resumed firing until Reynolds ordered him to seek aid. Their blood up, the other Marines closed in and drove the defenders from their positions, killing at least 30 as they scrambled for the shelter of another pillbox. By then dusk had arrived, and the surviving Marines dug in, still separated from their comrades. As daylight faded, Colonel Hart opted to cease offensive operations in favor of digging in with expectations of securing the island the following morning. Knowing that the northern beaches were but 200 yards away, the few combat veterans thought this foolish. Having experienced the terror of Japanese infiltration tactics and the inevitable Banzai attack, these veterans believed the regiment should have pressed on and finished the job. But being Marines, they obediently pulled out their entrenching tools and began hacking at the soil. Darkness fell. Star shells popped and shimmered throughout the night, illuminating a landscape filled with rotting corpses, shredded foliage, and the battered ruins of the enemy structures. No one slept. At times, the high-pitched crack of Arisaka rifles sounded from the rear as well as the front and flanks, evidence that the enemy was indeed all around. American arms responded, stitching the darkness with neon tracers. At times, determined infiltrators died at the edges of hastily dug foxholes. Marines died too, including young Hoppy Hopkins, who had earlier saved his lieutenant's life. Hopkins was mortally wounded while pulling flank security near Nadine Point. Just before daybreak, a rustling in the brush fronting the 3rd Battalion caused eyes to strain and heartbeats to quicken. Trigger fingers tensed as the thrashing swelled into a universal clamor, and then it happened. Banzai! Banzai! Japanese soldiers burst from the undergrowth in groups of 10 to 20, yelling madly and brandishing rifles, bayonets, and swords. The Marines let loose with everything they had. A gap between companies I and B was exploited, and the fight degenerated into a tangle of bayonets, knives, and clubbed rifles. Only the timely arrival of Company L and a few medium tanks stabilized the situation. Now reinforced, the Marines counterattacked. During the melee, 6 Marines had taken position in a shell hole when something thudded and rolled sputtering to their feet. Private Richard Sorensen hesitated and then threw himself on the grenade just as it exploded. In a nearby crater, Corpsman James Kirby was treating several patients after they had been overrun earlier that night and heard Sorensen's screams. Scrambling to his assistance, Kirby dragged Sorensen to his impromptu aid station, now overflowing with 15 wounded Marines. Although grievously wounded, Sorensen survived to receive the Medal of Honor for saving his buddies' lives. The entire action was over within 35 minutes. Company B's 3rd Platoon had nearly been wiped out, but more than 100 enemy corpses were strewn before its position. As a precaution against similar attacks, Lt. Col. Brunelli ordered Company K to rejoin his command from Paulin Point. General Schmidt, the divisional commander, had landed the previous evening and took command of the entire operation. Wanting to reinforce his line, he ordered Captain Neiman's Company C, 4th Tank Battalion, and a battalion of the 23rd to cross from Roi-Namur. At that time, only 4 tanks had sufficient fuel and ammunition to make the trip. These had assisted 3rd Battalion in repelling the early morning Banzai attack. But now, with supplies accumulating on both beaches, the remainder of Neiman's command was fueled, armed, and moving into position. The men of the 23rd were held as reserve. The attack would resume at 9 a.m. Company K, now reunited with Landing Team 3, would advance along the western shore with Companies I and L deployed to its right and supported by 2 platoons of Captain Neiman's medium tanks. Captain Koken's decimated Company B was pulled back as battalion reserve. Lieutenant Colonel Aquila Dias of 1st Battalion assumed command of the right flank after Francis Brink had been evacuated for wounds received during the bunker explosion. Dias kept Company G, now intact, connected with Brunelli's battalion, while Companies F, C, and A extended his line to the eastern shore. Captain Ross's Company E remained in battalion reserve while Company B, 4th Tank Battalion, would provide support. The attack began on schedule with Brunelli's men easily overrunning the few enemy troops that remained. Within 2 hours, his battalion had reached Nora Point on the island's northwest corner, where it turned right to sweep the oceanside beaches. Colonel Dias didn't get started until 10:05 a.m. due to the late arrival of his armor. The stubborn Nut Lane blockhouse continued to defy every attempt against it until tanks and half-tracks pounded it into submission. After that, the pace accelerated. Dias seemed to be everywhere at once, encouraging reluctant Marines here and leading others there as they combed the underbrush for battle-weary Japanese. By midday, his Marines were within sight of the northern beaches where 25 to 30 Japanese had rallied in a deep anti-tank ditch. A platoon of light tanks trundled up and scoured the trench with machine gun and canister fire. That done, Dias sprinted to the ditch's rim to direct one final assault, and a burst of machine gun fire ripped through his body. For his dynamic leadership and unflinching courage, Dias was awarded a posthumous Medal of Honor, the 4th and final such award for the two-day battle. Shortly after noon, both battalions converged near Natalie Point, the island's northernmost promontory, where the Marines rooted out the last of the die-hard defenders. By 2 p.m., the battle for Roi-Namur was over and the coveted airfield in American hands. The victors were horrified by the slaughter. Numerous ditches and trenches overflowed with mangled corpses, in places piled 5 deep. Most of these were victims of the fierce naval bombardment. Every building, tree, and shrub lay in ruins. Of the 3,563 defenders, only 92 were taken prisoner, more than half of them Korean laborers. The others were too stunned to resist. The Marines suffered 737 casualties in taking both islands, 190 killed. Formals of honor and 17 Navy crosses attest to the Marines' courage. Who knows how many unseen or unreported acts of valor were performed? Operation Flintlock was declared an unequivocal success. Having learned the bloody lessons of Tarawa, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had devised the blueprint for future amphibious operations, a plan that, with some adjustments, would prove invaluable through subsequent campaigns. With the Army's success at Kwajalein and another Marine victory at Eniwetok later that month, the conquest of the Marshalls was complete, and the stage set for the assault on the Marianas, from which American bombers could launch raids on the Japanese mainland. The struggle for Roi-Namur was the first combat action for the 4th Marine Division. The survivors would engage in other, bloodier battles as they did their part to dismantle the forces of Imperial Japan, including Saipan, Tinian, and ultimately the uncompromising horror that was Iwo Jima. But it was Roi-Namur where the Marines of the Fighting Fourth received their baptism of fire. Always attacking, never looking back.